Well, good evening, friends. So we now find ourselves in Holy Week. It's just a few days away from remembering again the events of the Easter weekend. And I want to think for a few moments about things which take place just before the eventual arrest of Jesus. And in line with what we've been doing in SBC this year, I'm going to read about these events in the way that they're described in Luke's Gospel. I want to read from chapter 22 and the first 6 verses. Now, the festival of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. Last May, the Co-op funeral directors published a list of the most popular songs which are now played at funerals in the UK. And this is something they actually do on an annual basis. But what's interesting about the list is that actually the top songs haven't changed in recent years. In fact, the top three hasn't changed at all. So people are opting for Somewhere Over the Rainbow by Eva Cassidy, Time to Say Goodbye by Sarah Brightman and Andrea Bocelli. And well, what do you think is number one? So there is no need for a drum roll here. There is no need for some dramatic pause because the number one choice is actually so predictable as to almost be a cliche. I'm sure that you've called it right. It is, of course, My Way by Frank Sinatra. But I wonder, why is it that this song is one which gets played so often on occasions like this? I wonder if maybe one obvious answer might be this desire that we have to feel like we're in control, to feel like we are the people who are sort of masters of our own destiny, masters of our fate, captains of our soul, in the words of Invictus, another poem which is another piece that gets played out and rolled out on occasions like this. We like to believe, don't we, that we are people who have forged our own destiny. And yet, if we're all honest, we all know that our lives and the things that happen to us, whether good or bad, are very much bound up with other people's actions and other people's decisions. So my guess is that when many of us look back on our lives and the major events in them, we probably have to admit that more often than not, those changes weren't things we made happen. They were things which happened to us. You know, there was the accident when we just found ourselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was the redundancy program where we worked, which may have been the result of a decision taken by someone else we never met, someone higher up in the company in their search for the bottom line. Maybe it was even bigger issues and changes like globalization. I can still remember the day when I went into my office in the UK and we were told that over half our jobs were going to be moved to India. And then there are other things. There were the illnesses which just came out of nowhere and they impacted us or a loved one. There was the rise in interest rates or the recession and it impacted our finances. Some of us might even think about our most important relationships and how they would change because of someone else's words or someone else's actions. I could go on, but you get the point. These things happen to us and they shake us. And I think they do that because they remind us of how little we actually are in control. Often in life, It's not my way. It's the government's way, or it's the company's way, or it's the other person's way. And I wonder if one of the reasons why so many of us have found the coronavirus pandemic so hard to deal with is this way in which it has just felt us leaving so exposed to events, to any sense that we're in control. It's just blown out of the water. Every one of us is now experiencing changes in our routines. What we can do and who we can see and where we can go is restricted, and it has to be. And yet it feels even bigger than that. It's the way this virus just seems to be there in the background all the time, and every interaction at the supermarket, every object we pick up, every item that the postman brings. There's that degree of wariness. Can I touch it? Where has it been? Who's handled it? And deep down, we're aware that we can do our best to shield ourselves from this illness, but we can't guarantee our safety. We can't spend our way to safety from the illness. We can't insure ourselves against it. We can't totally isolate ourselves from the risk. And as I've been thinking about this, I've been reflecting as well on the events of Holy Week. And I've been mulling over what might seem like some of us to be a strange question, but I think it's one that we've got to ask. I mean, to what extent is Jesus in control of the events of this week? Now, I realize this is a complex question. I realize there are big theological issues that come in and so on, but I think we need to wrestle with it. When Jesus makes his way to Jerusalem, does he know exactly what is going to happen to him? And I think the answer, strange as it might seem to some of us, is yes and no. Now, please don't misunderstand me. Clearly, an absolutely fundamental belief that we hold to as Christians is the truth that God sends Jesus to earth, not just to live for us, but also to die, to be that sacrifice for our sins. Jesus himself talks in the Gospels about the fate which awaits him eventually. But does he know exactly how it's going to be played out? See, as I've mentioned before, when you read Luke's Gospels, or Luke's Gospel, there's a very strong sense that this is a story which is only going to end in one place. There's this long section of the book where Jesus is on the road to Jerusalem, and he's very clear in his mind that he's got to be going there. He's got to head towards the city, in spite of the fact that to do so inevitably is inviting trouble for himself. Luke 13, he says, I must press on today and tomorrow and the next day, for surely no prophet can die outside Jerusalem. And in the very next verse, he refers again to Jerusalem as the city that kills the prophets and stones those sent to you. He knows this is not going to end well. And yet it seems to me that when we read the Gospel's accounts of Holy Week, there is a similar pattern being played out in Jesus' life to the one which we experience in our lives. There's this combination of the purposes of God being worked out, but it happens alongside and in response to the actions of other people who God holds responsible for the things that they do, the actions of other spiritual forces who I think are trying to work against God and his purposes, who mistakenly think they might even thwart his purposes. So can I invite you to just think again for a moment about those verses I read from the beginning of Luke 22 and think about the combination of differing motivations on behalf of all the people you find there. You've got the chief priests and the teachers of the law. And we're told that they're looking for some way that they can get rid of Jesus. And Luke explains that this is because of their fear of the people. Presumably, they've seen the people cheering Jesus on his entrance to the city on Palm Sunday, and they're thinking, gosh, we're going to lose power. We're going to lose influence here. What if this crowd gets ahead of itself and things get out of control? And then we've got Judas, one of the disciples, been so close to Jesus. He's been drawn so near. He's been part of the inner circle of Jesus, and yet he appears to be having doubts. He's had doubts, I think, for some time. Money's an issue, but there seems to be this greater underlying sense of just not believing anymore in how Jesus is going about things. I think that's what makes him so vulnerable at this moment when Satan enters into him. And Satan's mentioned, of course. Luke has no qualms by telling us he's someone else who is at work in this story. And then do you remember how the story progresses? And you see the actions of others contributing to what happens. There's the Roman governor Pilate. He acknowledges that he can't find a basis for the charges brought against Jesus, but he's weak and he can't do what he knows is the right thing to do. And then, of course, you've got the crowd themselves. You've got that mass of people who turn against Jesus and they switch sides and they demand instead the release of Barabbas. And if ever we've been part of a large crowd ourselves at a sports event or a political event or even a church event, we know what it's like. We know that as individuals, we can get swept along in the frenzy, in the changing mood of other people around us. And it just seems to me there are all of these different forces at work and different factors at work and different people. And they're acting out of fear or weakness or selfishness. And everything and everyone just seems to conspire against Jesus. He just walks into all these different motives, all these different actors. Jesus, who is the suffering victim, and he's the victim not just of violence, but just of all the dreadful circumstances which he's embroiled in because of what is going on in Jerusalem in Passover in AD 33. And I wonder if this is, another aspect of the surrender, of the loss that Jesus experiences when he becomes human. He loses the power of heaven. He gives up his equality with God, as Paul puts it in Philippians. He takes the nature of a servant. He's made in human likeness. So that means putting himself at the mercy of others. Means giving up control. And of course, God still works out his plan in all of this. There's another book, Colossians, which Paul writes, and he talks there about how God incredibly uses the actions of all the powers who conspire against Jesus, who think they can thwart God's purposes, to actually defeat them, triumphs over them by the cross, makes a spectacle of them, as Paul puts it there. And yet it's important for us to remind ourselves of these things and to confront ourselves with, my goodness, everything that Jesus goes through in this week, all that he goes through for us, just the immensity of the sacrifice ahead of the triumph of Sunday, and maybe to understand the implications of this for each of us as well. If you feel fearful and you feel overwhelmed by what you're going through at the minute, or if you feel you're not in control, just know that Jesus has been in that place for you in this longest of weeks. And Jesus is alongside you in these moments as well. And know as well that God can bring good out of terrible events. He brings good out of these terrible events in the city which kills the prophets and stones those who sent to it. He works out his purposes in this present season as well. He's been there. He knows. He's been in the place of surrender. And yet in his creativity and his goodness and his love and his determination to save and redeem and mend the world, the turning comes. And the turning will come. Let me finish, friends, by praying for you again. I pray, my friends, that you would know the abiding presence of God in what feels like a season of so much uncertainty. I pray that you would know him especially near and holding you in his everlasting arms at the times when things seem out of control. When the events of the virus seem so overwhelming, I pray his peace would push back and be far stronger, that you would have an assurance that his times are in your hands. Pray that you would feel the blessing of the great high priest who has eaten with his friends in the upper room and has cried in the garden and gone to the cross and intercedes still for you. Amen. God bless, and I'll speak to you again soon.